Hello and welcome to our panel discussion on Israel and Morocco, reflections on politics and culture 1 year after the historic proclamation of normalization between the two countries. My name is Michael Brenner and I'm the director of the Center for Israel Studies here at American University in Washington, D.C. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of our center. I also would like to thank Laura Cutler, our managing director, for her support in setting up this event. 1 year ago, in December of 2020, Morocco and Israel announced the normalization of their relations. And just a few days ago, Israel's Defense Minister Benny Gantz spoke to Israeli reporters during his historic visit to Morocco and told them not to be cynical about the importance of Israel's newfound relationship with Morocco, that this was not just an alliance to fatten the pockets of Israeli weapon makers or to advance a discrete policy objective, but something with social and cultural implications. So we'll take this first anniversary to discuss with two leading experts the deep roots of Jewish history and culture in Morocco and the meaning of last year's announcement for the political relations between Morocco and Israel. Former Israeli foreign minister and Tel Aviv University history professor Shlomo Ben Ami was born in Tangiers, Morocco, and immigrated to Israel as a teenager. In his academic career, he has written books on the Spanish Civil War and on the modern Middle East. As Israeli foreign minister, he was intimately involved in the Camp David and Taba peace negotiations in 2000-2001. And as vice president of the Toledo International Center for Peace, he has been involved in conflict resolution processes from Colombia and Georgia to Morocco and the Spanish Sahara. UCLA Anthropology professor and Maurice Amado chair in Sephardic studies, Aomar Boum, a native of Morocco as well, has researched and written widely about religious and ethnic minorities in the Middle East and North Africa. His ethnographic work engages the place of religious and ethnic minorities, such as Jews, Baha'is, Shias, and Christians in Middle Eastern and North African states. And among his book publications are Memories of Absence, How Muslims Remember Jews in Morocco, and also an edited volume on the Holocaust in North Africa. And before I ask my first question, allow me a few housekeeping remarks. Our event panel will last approximately 1 hour, and the last part of it will be dedicated to your questions, and please submit them through the Q&A function on your screen. I'm sure by now you're all familiar with it. We ask that no one record this event. We will record it and the recording will be made available on the CIS website after the fact. Also, this event is live captioned. So, good morning to California, to Professor Boum, and good morning and good evening to Israel, to Professor Shlomo Ben Ami. I'm start my questions to both of you, maybe starting with Shlomo. You were both born in Morocco, and I would be interested, and I think our audience as well, if you could tell us a little bit about your family history and your upbringing in Morocco, which I think is very different for the two of you. Shlomo, would you like to start?
Well, I grew up in what was possibly not a very typical Moroccan city, because it was at the time an international city. It got integrated into Morocco officially, formally in 1956, I think, or when Morocco became an independent state. So the city where I grew up was an inter-ethnic or a multi-ethnic community We went to a French school, but spoke at home mostly Spanish. On the street, we spoke Spanish. So, in spite of the city being international, it was closer to the Spanish intellectual, cultural orbit. In that sense, I think I got richer, academically speaking, by the fact that we had this French and Spanish influence at the same time. So I can say that France and Spain became since then very, very central in my life in terms of places that I love, cultures that I appreciate, and it remains to this very day, as you very well know, Michael. My Spanish connection then went to academia as well, to my history research, and France has always been close to my heart. So what I brought with me from Tangier, I believe, is empathy with different cultures and civilizations. We lived in one house with neighbors that were Arabs, Christians, refugees from the Spanish Civil War. And this was also the environment. When I walked to school, perhaps it was about, say, 500 meters, I don't know, half a kilometer. I would cross 2 or 3 different ethnic neighborhoods by walking to school. In that sense, I think this is the main heritage. And I believe it also, in a way, expresses what I believe is still the essence of Morocco as a whole. It is one of the most tolerant Arab countries I can think of.
One follow-up question, Shlomo, how integrated would you say was the Jewish community in where you grew up in Tangier? How integrated was the Jewish community?
Well, it's a very difficult question. Since there were different autonomies, as it were, autonomies, cultural and community autonomies, and superstructure, administrative superstructure. So in that sense, they were no different than the others. Perhaps the only difference is that everywhere, not only in Tangier, everywhere else in Morocco, Jewish communities were identified by the close internal organization and solidarity. The rich always needed to have pools around so that they can be generous and fulfill some kind of a mission. Someone once told me when I was ambassador in Madrid that many of the Jews that came from Tangier to live in Spain brought with them their pools. So to keep the structure of the community in a way, you have rich people and then you have poor guys, and otherwise there is no such a thing as a community. So you need to help them, you need to have to finance their schooling and so on and so forth.
Thank you. And let's hear from Aomar. You had a different experience in a different part of Morocco growing up.
Yeah, I grew up in the south, in a small oasis in the province of Tata in the Anti-Atlas Mountains. And what's interesting about that place is that you don't have that, you have some form of cultural diversity, especially influenced by the sub-Saharan African side, but you don't have this European, Western, Spanish or French, and to some extent even Italian diversity that you have in the north that Shlomo grew up in. So I grew up in a subsistence farming. But despite this marginal area in the south in Morocco where I lived, where my family still lives, what's interesting about my experience, my personal experience, is that I was able to travel and to live in different parts of the country. And because of the limited access to schooling and education in this part of Morocco, I was very fortunate to have the support of my brother and my family to, and also the state system, the state educational system that allows us to basically children from the south to move or to live in different parts of Morocco and by accessing public schooling. And so I lived in Marrakesh, where I actually lived not far from the Mellah in Marrakesh. One of my first encounters with Jews was in the neighborhood of Brima, called Brima, right outside of the Mellah. I also lived in Boum, in Beni Mellah, very famous Muslim Jewish community. And I had access to American schooling through Al Akhawain University in Ifran. So that's that experience by getting outside of the village, of that experience that not a lot of my brothers and my people from the village had access to, allowed me to see Morocco in a different perspective, see not only the diversity, but also see the complexity, the cultural complexity of the country.
And of course, much later, you did write about the memory of Jews in Morocco among Muslim Moroccans. You said you encountered, your first encounter with the Jewish community was when you moved to Marrakesh. And Morocco is indeed one of the very few Muslim countries where you can still encounter a small Jewish community. I guess most Moroccans probably never encountered the Jewish community, the small community there. But when you wrote your book, can you share some of the findings with us? How does that amazing, long, and rich Jewish heritage figure in the collective memories of Moroccans today?
Well, so let me preface this by stating that I was a little bit fortunate to be one of the, probably in the 1980s and the early 1990s, one of the few people who had more contact, Moroccan Muslims who had more contact with Jews. Not to say that a lot of people didn't, but the scales of it really diminished, because by 82 you start seeing basically the numbers started to decrease. So I was more interested actually in studying the Amazighs, and that's why my first work in the 1990s for my MA was on the use of Moroccan Amazigh culture in tourism. And going to the University of Arizona, where I started my PhD, what I wanted to work on is, again, in the same, reflects where I come from, and I had a different concern. I was interested more in environmental issues and on water management in the desert, in the Sahara. And that really, as I looked at these questions of water management, I thought that I didn't really have the skills and the expertise to tackle these issues. And a lot of my mentors at the University of Arizona were already thinking about these issues, given their expertise in Iran and their expertise in Morocco and other parts of the Middle East. So I thought about shifting my topic, and I was very lucky to see one of the, as part of the documents that I was looking at, had Islamic manuscripts that talk about this connection between Jews and Muslims over water and land management. And that's what got me into the focus on the Jews of the South. And so what I thought about doing, instead of really focusing or following this tradition, anthropological and historical tradition that has looked at these issues of Jews in urban context, what I thought is redirect the attention to the Muslim side. And that's why most of my work is really about Muslims' perceptions of Jews over a long durée, goes back for over generations, going to looking at the generations of the great-grandparents until the young adults. And again, focus on the South. I was not interested in urban contexts like Tangier or Casablanca or Marrakesh. I wanted to look at how communities that lived with Jews in these rural hinterland really thought and imagined Jews. And the separation is really different. The great-grandparents and grandparents think of them given through their social relations, historical social relations. The youth think of them in terms of the Arabo-Israeli conflict. And so even though the elders are aware of the ongoing conflict, but the discourse is more complex, more nuanced versus the youth. So that's what I would actually draw from as the general conclusion from the work.
And I'll come back to that later when we talk about the very recent development of the last year, how this is perceived. I'll move on to Shlomo in a way with a variation of the same question, talking about the Moroccan heritage in Israel. I mean, the Moroccan community is one of the largest communities in Israel, the Moroccan Jews. And of course, it is diverse, as we already heard. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about how this Moroccan heritage lived and lives on in Israel, and what the new relations mean for especially the Moroccan Jewish community. And I know it's a diverse community, but if we can generalize.
Yeah, well, I frankly do not consider myself an expert on the, on the history or the conditions of the heritage of the Moroccan Jews as part of the whole Israeli ethnic cultural tapestry. Over the years, we have seen more and more inter-ethnic integration. I was born in Morocco. My wife was born here. Her parents were born here, but her grandparents were born in Russia. And what do my kids consider themselves to be? Well, essentially Israelis. And since I myself grew up, once I came to Israel at the age of 12, I grew up in a kibbutz. Most of my life happened in the kibbutz movement. I didn't quite bequeath or give my kids any particular Moroccan customs or traditions. So I think my own personal experience hasn't been, in that sense, very ethnic. I wouldn't, but as a whole, when one speaks in Israel today about the Oriental problem, the so-called Mizrahi problem, they most fundamentally refer to the Moroccans, either because they are the largest Oriental, strange to say Oriental because Maghreb means West, but it's the longest one and possibly the less socio-academically advanced among the Orientals. Of course, you have then the Ethiopians came later on, but essentially people speak about the Moroccans as a problem of integration of the political base of the Israeli right, for example. Why? Because they haven't been yet integrated into the bourgeoisie, let alone the upper bourgeoisie, which is where you recruit supporters for the right of center and for the right. So I think that, but I wouldn't say really that the Abraham Accords had any particular significance for Moroccan Jews for one simple reason, that even without these accords, Morocco was always open, not only for Moroccan Jews, but for everybody. And in that sense, it's not a turning point that now Moroccan Jews, maybe technically it makes it easier for them to visit because you have direct flights, but there was a depth of feeling and nostalgia for Morocco, which is not very characteristic, by the way, of other Oriental Israeli communities. You don't have the same sense of nostalgia when you speak about Iraqi Jews, Yemenite Jews, Tunisians or others. But when it comes to Morocco, Morocco has received in the Israeli psyche a special place as a more open Arab country, and where everybody is sort of welcome. You know, my first visit to Morocco was in 1984, and I personally, before being in government, I met Hassan the second, that is the father of the current king, in 1988 in Marrakesh. So Morocco was open to Israelis, and there is no such a feeling that, oh, now something of historic dimension happened. We had representative officers, we had trade, we have security links. I remember that particular conversation with the king in 1988. For him, he could not understand Morocco without the Jewish community. It was a major personal and national tragedy. This is how he saw it. May I remind you that in I think it was 1955 or 1958, or either 55 or 58, he was still crown prince, and he gave a speech in Beirut about the need of before Habib Bourguiba. He was much more ahead of Habib Bourguiba, in which he called on the Arab world in 1955 to normalize relations with Israel. So I think that I didn't see the Abraham Accords as a turning point for the Jewish Moroccan community, not even for Israel, in the sense that we already had these kind of relations. So Benny Gantz, whose knowledge of history isn't particularly edifying, for him it may sound as a change. It isn't a major change. Now that it's only you, me, and Aomar on the listening, we had security links over the Sahara for years. Israel shared the technological and security know-how and material for years with the Moroccans, and you know, this is what Ben Shabbat, do you see this?
Yeah.
A guy working in the royal household sent me this when his name is Salim, when he sent it through Ben Shabbat, the national security advisor of Netanyahu, when he was there to sign the Abraham Accords. So why? Because we knew each other for years. The head of the Moroccan CIA, Kadiri, was a very good friend. I knew him from the 1980s. So there were always relations.
So is there...
And then we are back because of the Sahara mainly.
Yes, and we'll come to the Sahara also. I want to just follow up and ask you, and you say, of course, these relations have been there, not always official, but they have been there. Do you see, though, any change, any significant change in making the relations official? And also last week, it was the first time that Israel signed a defense treaty with another Arab state. Do you see this as maybe more
Absolutely. I think that formalizing the relations, upgrading them, it's of extremely significance that one cannot underestimate. I think I place them in a continuum, but in this continuum, you have here an upgrading which cannot be ignored, obviously. And even, by the way, before the signing of this particular agreement, after the signing of the Abraham Accord, Moroccan Air Force participated in drills here in Israel. So before the signing of the agreement that Gantz had just signed when he went to Morocco. So yes, that's no doubt an upgrading. It is also important in the following sense. Omar was right, I think, in his when he observed that the difference between the younger generation and the older generation when it comes to Israel, Morocco, or Israel or Palestine, or the problem of Palestine. There is a very interesting difference here between Muhammad VI and his father. And for Muhammad VI to relegate Palestine to a secondary position, when for him and for his generation, Arafat, Palestinian nationalism, the suppression of the Palestinian people, all these were things that were very central in his persona, in his political and intellectual persona, as it were. He didn't have the same kind of cynicism that you could see with in the case of Hassan. I remember in a second visit I had with the king, with Hassan, this time in Rabat in 1993, Arafat should go away. These guys have betrayed the objectives of Palestinian nationalism. You need a new generation of leaders, etc. But when I saw Mohammed VI in Agadir after the Islamic conference, I mean, for him, Arafat was an idol. It was the icon of Palestinian nationalism and the cause that his generation in Morocco shared with the others. So I think that in that sense, for him to relegate Palestine could be done only in exchange for such a high price for him and for all Moroccans, such as the Sahara. I mean, here the role of the United States is crucial, is vital. This is the way to get, Israel has become the agent through which you get to the heart of American Congress and American public opinion and so on.
And that's maybe a good point to go to Omar, go back to you. We just heard that that change between the attitude between King Hassan and King Mohammed. And I wonder in what respect it reflects the population as a whole. If you speak about peace between Israel and Egypt, which is much longer, we always speak about a cold peace, a peace that it didn't really enter the hearts of most Egyptians. And I wonder, you as somebody who's dealt a lot with the memories, but also the presence of the Moroccan population, how would you say is this peace or this normalization perceived among Moroccans in general?
I think so. Let me go back to some of the points that Shlomo mentioned as far as this the normalization of these relations. I agree with Shlomo. I think this is just this is not a breaking news. I think if you look at different phases, I would go to the 60s, for instance, when Hassan II and Bourguiba were competing about what kind of relationship they would have about their members of the Jewish communities of their respective countries in Israel, as well as the Ashkenazi Jews in the United States. Especially before 67, the relationships were already there. And then you fast forward to the 1970s, where Hassan II became really a major figure as a mediator between different Arab countries, especially Egypt. So all of these things that showcase that these connections, not only in terms of military corporations or intelligence corporations, but also the fact that you have a very strong Moroccan Jewish community that is politically, that became politically strong with Begin, especially after the late 70s with Begin. And Begin really put the stamp of the cultural importance of Moroccan Jews. So all of these things, I think, make this relationship, historically speaking, always, I would say, formal and normal in many ways. Now, how do Moroccan society, which is actually the focus of a lot of work that I've been doing, including with Daniel Schroeter, we're working on actually a book related on the monarchy, Israel and Moroccan Jews, over the last in the 20s, since independence and during the period of Mohammed VI. When you look at the Moroccan view is very diverse. So you have people who are 100% in support of this agreement. You have a lot of people who are very critical of this agreement, and they're open about it. And but what the change is that I think it's allowing a conversation, a more public conversation in the public sphere in Morocco, not only in the media, but also in people's households. And the fact that you see interviews, Moroccan Jews on national TV, talked about on national TV, which is something that you didn't see in the 1980s and 1990s during Hassan II. Hassan II had that control over what we call the Jewish dossier or the Jewish question. In the post 2000, during Mohammed VI period, you do have this normal conversation, and it was done through culture, and it was reinforced through culture. And a culture, because there is the shared knowledge. Moroccan Jews speak Moroccan Arabic, they speak Tamazight, they speak Spanish, they speak French in the same way that Moroccan Muslims do. And when you allow these cultural debate and the cultural conversations, you gave it some form of normalcy. And as well as festivals. So the fact that you have these festivals in cities like Essaouira or Fez, or where Israelis of Moroccan descent attend these events. So in a sense that you have these different phases allowed for some form of now public acceptance of the political official normalization. And it's, I think, just to go back to say the last point I want to say is that for Israel, personally, I think this is for Israel more important than the deal that they had with the Egyptians and the deal that they had with Jordan and other countries, or the Gulf, or members of the Gulf states, because of the voting bloc. You have close to 1 million Israelis of Moroccan descent, and that if each party in Israel is still fighting for that voting bloc, and they make political parties strong or weaker. And for Israel, I think it's an important point. For Morocco, as an anthropologist, time will tell. So I have to wait and see. There is the historical knowledge. We have the historical knowledge, but how things will move. So as an anthropologist, for me, it's interesting to figure out and to see how these conversations were going to play out in the next coming years or decade.
Yes, I mean, we don't know because.
May I just?
Yes, sure, go on.
Just to add one point, I think it is extremely important to underline one perspective here, if I may. There is a difference between the Arab countries, the immediate neighborhood, the countries bordering with Israel. Even though they have peace with Israel, they do not have normalization. Take Egypt, take Jordan, because they are too close to the core of the problem. They fought Israel. They are part of the conflict, of the Palestinian conflict in one way or another. Whereas the countries in the second circle, such as the Persian Gulf or the Arab Gulf, take for example the Emiratis, Bahrain, and others, Saudi Arabia, you can have there, and Morocco, you can have normalization either immediately after you sign a peace agreement, as we have now with the Emiratis, or even before it. In a way, we had normalization or quasi-normalization with the Moroccans, even without having signed the agreement. And the same you can say about countries in the Gulf. I personally met 20 years ago, the Omani foreign minister, the Qatari prime minister, Saudi officials in the United States, Bandar bin Sultan and others, before we had these Abraham Accords. So I think the first circle is the countries that were part of the conflict. And then when you sign an agreement, a peace agreement, it doesn't produce normalization. And the countries in the second and third circle, where normalization comes easier, because although there is this solidarity, understandable solidarity with Palestinian cause, it is still, they were not involved in a way. I mean, you know, they were not involved as deeply as the Jordanians and the Egyptians were involved in the conflict. This is one. And the second has to do with Morocco specifically. Morocco is a very, very interesting country. I think it differs from any other country in North Africa and perhaps in the whole of Africa in the following sense. It is the only third world country, quotation marks, that hasn't gone through a Marxist revolution, a one-party system, a secular utopia that ended up like in Algeria with a shortage of couscous, which could bring about the couscous revolution or the couscous instability that was created. I think it was about 20 years ago, and then a whole civil war. And I mean, the failure of the FLN is monumental. This explains, I think, why Albert Camus was so right in resisting Algerian independence. He seemingly envisaged what could happen in Algeria, in countries like Algeria, or look at Egypt, Libya, all other countries. Morocco independence was born through the monarchy. The monarchy, the king was the head of the national movement that brought about independence. I remember as a young kid when Muhammad the fifth was exiled to Madagascar. It was in 1950 something, and the French put a puppet king, Moulay Arafa, that was the name I still remember. Jews went on the streets to call for the return of the king. So I think that the fact that the new modern state was born through the monarchy, that has a religious sanction at the same time, don't forget that. If you look at the Arab Spring, you will see that the only countries that really resisted, the only regimes that resisted the popular avalanche were the monarchies. The republics collapsed in Tunisia, in Libya, in Yemen, in Egypt. So I think, whereas the monarchies resisted, precisely because, one, the religious sanction, and the kind of, and Morocco, even in this, was very wise. I mean, it always managed to draw a very fragile but still stable course between identifying with the whole Arab cause and the Palestinian cause, and a step ahead of the others when it comes to normalization with Israel, even before the Abraham Accords. So this gave this country the sense of being reliable, a reliable partner for Europe, for the United States. It was a political unit, even years before independence. The Americans and the Moroccans always say that Morocco was the first state to recognize American independence in 1776. So I think that you have here the case of a very, very special sort of country that managed to produce stability and reliability in its international relations. One issue is, however, beyond discussion, and that is the Sahara. And this is the key to understanding the current upgrading. Without that, it might not have happened.
Can I actually follow up? And that's actually the first question I'm taking from Bob Friedman from Johns Hopkins University, where he asks what is there to the Sahara point of the agreement. So I think nobody's better qualified than you to answer that.
Well, Donald Trump recognized Morocco's sovereignty over the Sahara. You know, there is a UN resolution that that speaks about the need for a referendum and give the right of self-determination to the Sahrawi nation, people. And the Moroccans never accepted that. And by the way, there has been a joint declaration by Obama and Mohammed VI seeing autonomy as one way of self-determination for the Sahrawi people, not necessarily statehood. Now, this is what Trump gave them, not autonomy, but yes, this is Moroccan sovereignty. This recognition is invaluable for the Moroccans. That's the number one national security issue, the number one issue that goes into the national identity. There is nothing else that is as important as this. And if we need to formalize relations with Israel, we'll go with it. Don't forget also another point, and this is 2011. I mean, 2011 has been a watershed for all Arab regimes. Suddenly, Islamism became a threat. Iran is playing with the Sahara question. It has been playing with the Sahara question for years. In fact, you don't have diplomatic relations. They cut diplomatic relations. The Moroccans and the Iranians do not have, and nothing to do with Israel. So Israel is at odds with the Iranians. It is at odds with the Iranians also from the viewpoint of the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, the Saudis, which again brings Israel closer to these governments, particularly as the United States seems to be rebalancing its strategic global priorities and withdrawing from the region. So Israel, to many of these regimes in the Middle East, is a reliable ally, no less and perhaps even more than the US, because nobody knows what the US will do next in terms if there is a nuclear capacity developed in Iran. Is the US going to do anything about it? The only thing these regimes know is that Israel is doing about it whatever it can. So in that sense, it looks to them as a more reliable partner.
Thank you, Shlomo. I continue with the questions from the audience, and as always, we take the student questions first. Theo Hyman Bachman is asking about King Mohammed's recent statement that he said he wants to use the good relations Morocco has with Israel and the Arab world to reboot the peace process. Are these just empty words to reaffirm Morocco's support for Palestine, or should we expect a significant move by Morocco in this direction? Now, I think, Shlomo, you were the one who negotiated in the actually last meaningful peace negotiation 20 years ago.
I frankly think that this is not empty word. I think that the king has put his finger on the essence of the new paradigm that I believe Europe and the United States should embrace and try to advance a solution for the Palestinian problem through the Arab world, to the surrounding Arab world. In the past, the peace process was about Palestine being the epicenter of the worries of the Arab world. And if you solve Palestine, you will have peace. You will have practically the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, what is happening is that the Arab-Israeli conflict is ending. For all practical purposes, there is no longer an Arab-Israeli conflict, but the Palestinian wound is still open. And what King Mohammed was trying to say, I believe, is let us use this change of environment to advance a political solution for Palestine. And I believe that this is, it was started by the Arab Peace Initiative in 2002 that spoke about a regionalization of the solution. In Central America, you had peace in the 1980s through what they used to, what Oscar Arias, the president of Costa Rica, got the Nobel Peace Prize for that, what he called países amigos, the friendly states around El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua that came together to try, not force, but coax the parties into a political solution. So I believe that this change of paradigm should from now on be the basis for a new approach to the Arab-Israel, to the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Thank you.
Can I say something about
yes,
that?
I want, Omar, can I go on to you and ask you also a follow-up question from another? But keep also what you want to add to what we just heard. I also want to add a question by Maury Osharov, who asked, what about the circumstances under which most of the Jews in Morocco left for Israel? Has Morocco apologized for their treatment or given any restitution for property?
Okay, so let me first respond to the question that about the role of Morocco in the Palestinian questions and answer that question. So I agree with Shlomo. I think this is probably Morocco's moment to play a key role as far as bridging this gap, this political gap between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and use the Moroccan card. I don't know how effective it will be within Israel, but I think this is a moment that's different from Mohammed V, even when during his visit to Jerusalem in the 60s, and his father Hassan II, who played a major role, was always had open doors to both camps, the Palestinian camp and the Israeli camp. And I think that approach of being always a mediator and trying to figure out a way how to connect both the Palestinians and the Israelis is probably one of the Morocco's best, I would say, chances to figure out a way how to help the Palestinians in their negotiation with the Israelis. So that's why I think it's an important point, and it's a serious point, and I don't think it's just a lip service. Now, when you think about as far as the migration, I think the recent decision by the Supreme Court of Israel, not even for the reparation during what happened to the experiences of North African Jews, and especially Moroccan Jews during World War II, is also, I think, it's a sign that a lot of Moroccans did not want to get those reparations, at least in general, because it would signal that they were mistreated by the Moroccan monarchy and the Moroccan society, and especially given the position of how Moroccan Jews view Mohammed V as their savior. So during World War II. But if you fast forward to the migration, I think the migration is more complex. You have to think about it in not only during the 1940s and 50s and 60s, but it's a decision that was made between the Israelis and the Moroccan state in the 1960s to allow Jews to migrate. And that's why Hassan II had more importance in Israeli society than probably his father, because he was seen as somebody who allowed the Jews to leave. And even in terms of even the repatriation of their bodies to cemeteries in Jerusalem, for instance, he would always he allowed that too. So the idea of reparation, I don't think it's, not even Moroccan Jews agree on that. That's number one. The idea of that Jews were forced from Morocco, looking at the archives and from my understanding, I don't think that was the case, because it was an agreement that involved Zionist organizations, the Mossad, the Israeli state, and so on and so forth. So it was a decision that was taken by both countries. And also you have to look at the personal stories, why people leave. People left for their own reasons. So it's and that's I think why a lot of people are resistant to this idea that they have to be this. The Moroccan Jews were forced. They were, personally, I don't think they were forced out of the country.
I agree absolutely with this question of reparations from an additional perspective. You know, Jews, Moroccan Jews here in Israel. You started by asking me about the heritage, etc. I think that one of the challenges of the Jewish community, the Jewish Moroccan community in Israel, is the challenge of belonging to the Zionist ethos. It's not, I mean, this state was not created by the Jews who came from Central and Eastern Europe, even though they came first. But we also have had our millennial dreams about the return to Zion, and we settled here the land, and we lived in agricultural farms along the borders of Israel, etc. We are part of this ethos. And so you cannot have it both ways and say that, and by the way, this is unlike the case of the Palestinian refugees. Palestinian refugees were spread throughout the Middle East, not because they wanted to go to, or they had a millennial dream to be refugees in Iraq and Syria and Jordan and what have you. But the Moroccan Jews claim, and this is their struggle for belonging to the Zionist ethos, that they are part of the Zionist continuum. They are part of the dream of Jews throughout history to create their independent state, to come back to Jerusalem, etc. So you cannot claim on the one hand that this is what you want and this is what you did, and then, and by the way, not compensate the Palestinians, not think even of compensating the Palestinians. You know, the whole debate between us and the Palestinians during the negotiations was that they were not against compensation, but they wanted that Israel would compensate them through the property that they left behind. And Israel was not even willing to address it. And that, so why a Moroccan Jew would now ask, and by the way, you used to ask this in negotiations with the Palestinians, and the Palestinians would always tell you, what the hell do you want me from? What do you want from me? I mean, that's not a problem that concerns us as Palestinians. We have a problem with the Moroccans. Go to speak to the Moroccans. Why is this an item in peace negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians when Israelis are not even willing to address compensation for property in Israel left behind by the Palestinians? So I wrote a review of Benny Morey's book in Foreign Affairs where I addressed this particular issue, because he also mentions the need for compensation for Jews from Arab world. He doesn't speak specifically about Moroccans, but I think this is about Morocco. Why would anybody, when Mossad agents were hyperactive in Morocco in recruiting Jews for legal and illegal immigration from Morocco, and then you say, well, okay, I went because I love Zion, or because the Mossad recruited me, and then I want also compensation. I mean, it doesn't make to me any sense, frankly, particularly as you ignore the property rights of the Palestinians.
Yeah, no, there is, of course, you're absolutely right. There is a contradiction. Either you say, from a Zionist perspectives, you all should leave your country and come to Israel because Zion is so deep in your heart that you want to come. And at the same time, you say you were expelled. Of course, sometimes they can go together. I mean, the case of Iraq was very different from Morocco and others. Yeah. But you're right. I mean, this we have to be very careful.
You see, Michael, the collapse of Jewish communities in North Africa came with the collapse of French colonialism. I mean, the French were the buffer in a way. Once, even in Tangier, I remember the Spanish Legion coming to the Jewish neighborhoods to protect Jews. I'm speaking about 1954, 1955. As a kid, I saw them with my own eyes. I mean, suddenly Arab nationalism changed the attitude. So there was an end that came with the end of French colonialism. We were part of major waves of history, of impersonal forces of history. And I mean, that was not nobody's intention. I mean, I think that the Moroccans regretted it, that the Jews left. But go now and start. Maybe it is easy for me to speak because we hardly had any property.
There are still a lot of questions. I can't get all of them, but I want to get a few. There is two, I would say, which I would ask Aomar. Aomar, there is one which just came in from Katur Nazum. As a Moroccan, I know that Moroccan Jews are eligible for Moroccan nationality, unlike other countries. My question is, does that give them a sense of belonging as a Moroccan or not? And maybe you can say something. I don't know, actually. I know Spain and Portugal extend the nationality. I didn't know that about Morocco, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And there is one by Professor William Miles, who asks about testifying to the danger of evoking today the memory of Jews in Timbuktu and elsewhere in Mali. Is southern Morocco vulnerable to any similar trans-Sahelian Islamist pressure? So I'm asking these two questions to you, Aomar.
So yes, I think for the passports question, yes, Moroccan Jews don't lose their citizenship just like Moroccan Muslims do. So you have and that's actually something that Hassan II was credited for, is that he made sure that connection with the country always stayed at the bureaucratic level as well as the cultural and emotional level to the country. And so you can be living as a Moroccan, you live in Israel or in Venezuela or any part of the world, and then you apply for citizenship. As long as you go through the process, you will get it. So that it has nothing to do with the Portuguese or the Spanish ploy, I would say, to attract Jews back after the 2015 decision by these governments. Now, as far as the southern Morocco and Jews, well, there are no Jews anymore in that part of the country. You still have a few families who, descendants of a few families who opted to stay especially in the cities of Gulmim and the cities of mostly Gulmim. That's the farthest city where Jews actually lived. Even though Moroccan Jews will live so the Jews of Timbuktu were originally descendants of the Jews of Aqqa, the site that I studied. So, but those communities ended in 1962 mostly, and most of them have left. I think the question about the Islamist and the Al Qaeda of the Arab Maghreb, that's a different question. It has nothing to do with the Jews. It has more to do with regional security and economic security that's going on today in the region. So,
okay, thank you. And let me take a last question. I know our time is almost up. Another student, Daniel Marino, asks, and I think this is more for Shlomo again, is it likely the countries in the first circle, what you said before, the first and second circle, of direct conflict with Israel can achieve formalized strategic relations similar to those developing the second circle, given the increasing importance of building partnerships with the US? So in a way, if the Abraham Accords can be expanded to the first circle.
Well, yes, I think that, but it will be more difficult because of Palestine. I think that so long as you do not have some sort of peace settlement with the Palestinians, it would be extremely difficult to conquer the heart of the Arab street in Egypt and Jordan. Let us not forget. All these peace agreements even included the peace agreement with Morocco, is a peace with governments, is a peace with regimes. It's not a popular peace in a way. I mean, it's not peace with the people. It's not peace between peoples. It is peace based on interest. In some cases, as in Morocco, about the tradition, history, common appreciation of the past, etc. But essentially, it is with governments and regimes, and it is an interest-based peace agreement. As I said before, this sense of insatisfaction affects particularly the peoples around, or the closer neighborhoods. I don't see that this can happen today. You see, the relations between Israel and Egypt today have never been better than any time in the past. But I'm not sure that the Egyptians know about it. It's it's Assisi that knows about it. It's the military, the Egyptian military. Israel is even actively assisting in the Sinai Peninsula, which is sovereign Egyptian territory, is assisting the Egyptians fighting different branches of Al-Qaeda or Daesh or whatever. So I think that the relations are extraordinary, but I am sure that if you conduct an opinion poll, you will see 90% popular rejection of Israel. It might be less in the Emiratis, it might be certainly less in Morocco, but still these are peace agreements with governments and regimes. It will take time, long time, I believe, until it becomes a peace with the nations.
Can I say something, Michael, about that?
Yes, closing words.
I
yes.
think I agree with Shlomo. I think what has to happen is that people have to see changes in the kitchen and on the table to make sure to think about what is good, what is interesting for them as far as this deal, and that's I think something that important. I think I would say in the case of Morocco. So it's still, I would say, an agreement that happened at the highest level. So how does it translate to the general Moroccan society? That's something that have to be seen, and that's where economic agreement and economic impact will be essential, as well as what role would the government and the monarchy would play in figuring out a way to amend and to reach a solution between the Palestinians and the Israelis.
Yes, and I agree. I think if Israel is only a means for Morocco to achieve something they want in their region with the Sahara, then this can be a short-lived story, like it was in the 1990s, where there were agreements between Israel and Tunisia and some other countries that came to an end with the Second Intifada in 2000. So we have to wait. But from all I've heard today from both of you, it seems that the Moroccan story is a special story. It's a different story because of the history of a large Jewish community, not only in Morocco, but also of a large continuing Moroccan community in Israel, and the deep relations that existed even before formalizing the ties. So I really can't thank you both enough. Yes, Shlomo. Yes.
A second.
Yes.
When Arab regimes see as the stability, political stability as the major objective, regime stability, then Israel has a chance. When democracies normally do not see regime stability as an objective, because instability is inherent in democracy. And therefore, what these peace agreements serve is the regime stability, because the regime has enemies. And in democracy, governments have rivals. They do not have enemies. And this is a major difference. Therefore, the Arab Spring or if you have a new Arab Spring, a much more powerful and perhaps even successful Arab Spring, this might change the parameters, the strategic parameters of the region in terms of the attitude or whether these peace settlements would hold or not.
Yes, that remains to be seen, of course.
Yeah.
And I cannot thank you enough, both of you, for your wisdom, for your insights, for your different perspectives you gave us. And I know you're both busy, and I'm really very grateful that you took the time to be with us. We do hope to have both of you again in person here. For now, my thanks to both of you and also to our audience. I think we had wonderful questions, especially also from our students. I apologize to all of those whose questions I could not take. And we will keep all of you, of course, informed about our upcoming programs in the next semester. Thank you all, and let's hope for good and long-lasting relations between the two countries.
Thanks,
Goodbye.
Michael. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Shlomo.